It's not just academic disciplines, but it's also community members, it's practitioners, it's external stakeholders, it's even patients in some of the contexts. So how do we do that? I mean, one of the benefits of doing that, of course, is that you can engage with the big challenges like rural health and improving rural health and sustainability and all of the poverty and all of the things that the big problems that we have, and we need multiple disciplines, multiple viewpoints on it. But one of the challenges with this is that, you know, there are a lot of assumptions and expectations and priorities that go unsaid, and it ends up creating frictions in teams, in cross-disciplinary teams, because there's so much knowledge that needs to be communicated explicitly because people are coming from so many different backgrounds. I'm currently at a Teams conference, and these are my people, right? So one of the benefits and the joys of being at a Teams conference like this one is that I don't have to explain a whole lot in terms of, you know, the background and the methodologies that we use and what's the values and the priorities of team science, because I'm surrounded by people that already know that. They already have all of a similar background to mine. So that's what makes it really enjoyable. In cross-disciplinary collaborations with people coming from so many different backgrounds and disciplines and ways of thinking and worldviews, you don't have that. So you need to be very explicit about communicating. And it's very easy to assume things that that you can't really assume in that kind of collaboration. So I want to just focus in on a few trouble spots for cross-disciplinary collaborations regarding incentives and expectations when you have people coming together for a research project. What are some of these trouble spots? Timelines and research outputs and dissemination. So I want to talk about some questions. Some of these are challenging questions to engage in, but they're really helpful to have an explicit discussion about. So, for example, when you talk about clarifying incentives and roles, you know, what do you want out of this collaboration? You know, as academics, we just assume that people want publications, right? That's what we're after. Patents maybe, but community members, practitioners, they may have very different goals in terms of a research collaboration. It's important to talk about that. How do you see your roles and responsibilities on the team and that of others? You know, that's really critical. You may be assuming that somebody else is taking the lead, and they may be assuming that you're taking the lead. And without discussion, these assumptions, you know, can cause havoc in terms of coordinating efforts and cognition and not developing a shared cognition. Are there specific methods that are non-negotiable for you? And what components of the research design maybe you're more flexible and can be adjusted? So thinking about these things as academics, sometimes we can get pretty rigid on terms of I have to have this method, I have to have this protocol followed to the T. Whereas, you know, maybe that's not even possible or feasible when you're dealing with messy raw data that happens in communities and in actual organizations. Who has the final word on those critical components of interventions and research designs? Again, this is not a comfortable question to necessarily ask, but boy, does talking about these things really help to bring clarity and bring out, you know, the areas where, oh, I was assuming this, but oh my goodness, that's really not a safe assumption. So what's at stake, or how important are the results to your organization? You know, how are mixed or null or negative results received? For example, you know, null results from my standpoint, you know, often that's not publishable, depending. I mean, it may be, but there are caveats to that. So I'm not excited about null results, but other people might be. When you find no gender effects, that may be extremely exciting for practitioners in the field, community members, and so forth. So talking about, again, these kinds of things. What if the hypotheses aren't supported? Are there even going to be hypotheses in what is discussed? And then, what's in stone and what can't be changed. And this is not just from a research standpoint in terms of methodologies or what do you have to have, but it's also in terms of feasibility, in terms of community members. Sorry, we're not going to get this particular data from this particular entity at this particular time. That's not in the cards. We can't do it. So then ahead of time what's happening. Timelines, boy, this is really important. What timelines matter most to people, and when do big decisions need to be made? Again, at my team's conference, we all know that this conference is at this particular time, so major deliverables shouldn't be happening at the end of July when we're at this conference, but other people in the team may not know that, and they're not going to know it unless I share that. What calendar do you follow? As an academic, we're following, a late August to April, end of April calendar. That's our what we're entrained to, but that's very different from practitioners who may be following more of a January to December calendar. When our community members, when are their big deadlines that have to do with maybe grant renewals and different events that they have going on. Again, you take for granted certain information when you're corresponding and communicating with people that are very much like you, trained in your area, but you really need to not take that for granted when you're talking with people of different disciplines. Key dates when you need results. Boy, this is so important. As academics, I know my submission deadlines for conferences, for different maybe publication outlets, special issues, and that's what I'm looking at. But community members may have certain events that they need information from, or I'm going to be giving a briefing to this particular granting agency that I need the preliminary data in order to make the case for the next year's funding. Practitioners may have certain discussions, meetings, important meetings, budget cycles that need to be taken into account, and funding decisions, that we need to know about. If we don't make the case here, then we're not going to get funding for the next year. So therefore, we need to entrain to that so we get what we need to have accomplished by then. And then even dates and times that you're unavailable. I always, if you take your family vacation at a certain time and then it's like, oh, wow, that's the very week that this major grant submission is due, talking about those things ahead of time, boy, it really saves a lot of angst later in the process. And just one more set of questions, research outputs. I'm doing some work now on interdisciplinary teams and looking at areas that are troublesome, and this is certainly one of them, where there's less agreement than in other areas. So things like, what are the minimum outputs that you need from this collaboration? Now, in terms of a tenure track faculty member, that may be a publication in a top-tier journal. That's what I need out of this collaboration. For practitioners, it may be an executive summary. For community members, it may be some sort of a final report that they need. Who is your target audience? Because again, that's going to be very different depending on what constituencies you're trying to reach. What outputs do you want to lead versus co-author? I'll just be on that. I don't want to lead that, but I can lead this, and division of responsibility here. What experimental results need to be replicated before, will the experimental results need to be replicated before they can be used? This is really important because as academics, we may be entrained to certain practices that take longer, and community members, practitioners, generally speaking, they're operating on a faster time clock than academics, which tends to be probably a slower process of trying to get it right, internal validity, things like that, that may not be part of what they necessarily value. So talking through that, what's the review process? Even across disciplines, this varies enormously. I've been amazed at some of my engineering colleagues that are struck by how long it takes in psychology to get things published, and engineering tends to be a little bit faster review process in general. So yes, again, these differences don't come out until you are in the throes of cross-disciplinary collaboration. How many iterations or reviews, are we going to go through before we get this out? And then, are you going to share it on social media, traditional media? Is that okay? Is it okay to do that before publication, before certain executive summaries are written, final reports, or is that only afterwards? What are we comfortable with as a team? So in terms of how to do this, it's good to think about these questions individually and then come together to discuss, because again, some of these questions you got to think about, what am I really trying to achieve in this? And then answers to these questions can be written down, externalized in terms of a collaborative plan, team charter. Those are best practices in team science. But also these things change, values change over time. What you may be wanting out of the collaboration may change as you go along and learn new information. So check-ins. So what is one question that you can ask in your cross-disciplinary collaborations this week that would help bring more clarity of the many I've mentioned, just as a take home? And then to learn more, I got a lot of this information out of this resource on how to have these difficult conversations in cross-disciplinary teams. And thank you for your kind attention.
Thank you so much, Susan. I don't know how you always pack so much wisdom in such little time.